And the clicker works? Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. So I had, hoped to have some fresh strontium data to incorporate into my talk today, but the timing didn't work out. So instead, I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about in a way that I think isotope analysis can really contribute to some different aspects in zooarchaeology. So I'm gonna, and I think it's a really neat way that we can continue to push things beyond the baseline. So critical voices in social zooarchaeology emphasize the need for non-anthropocentric approaches, ones that foreground socially embedded and embodied nature of human-animal relations. Embodiment, both in terms of the ethological proclivities and capacities of different animals and in the forms of human-animal interactions, is key to what is developing under this label of critical social zooarchaeology. The central place of embodiment in these theoretical approaches, I argue, is precisely what makes isotopic analysis a potentially crucial set of methods for this approach. Isotopic analyses, which as we've seen today and yesterday, can provide detailed and varied information about the biographies of animals in terms of diet, reproduction, nurturance, and movement. And so they make it possible to examine the embodied forms of action in the past that critical social zooarchaeology is centering. The potentials here are many, but for today, I want to highlight one place where I see an especially productive point of overlap between the theoretical orientations of social zooarchaeology and the methods of isotopic analysis. And this overlap is eating and feeding. So archaeological, historical, and anthropological studies of human-animal relations have a lot to say about feeding and eating. Ethnographic and historical work on societies in the Amazon have introduced this concept of familiarizing predation. So this is a historically and culturally specific idea, and I'm not saying we should take it elsewhere, but what I like about it is that the work on this concept highlights that eating and feeding are consequential acts. They do things in the world, and that matters. In the Amazon, eating something runs the risk of becoming what you eat, and feeding can be a way of turning something from an other or an enemy into your kin. So what this specific example underscores is the idea that how and what or who you eat and who you feed and how makes a difference. It encourages me to consider the kind of historically and culturally specific practices that fall under this larger category of eating and feeding, resisting the kind of push to homogenize or ignore it, particularly when we're thinking about our relationship with domesticated herd animals. So familiarizing predation focuses on people's relationship with wild and tamed animals, but there are other sources that can help us think about the stakes of feeding and eating in relationship to domesticated herd animals. So I think that thinking about feeding and eating as socially embedded encourages us to consider them in at least two different ways: in relationship to reproduction and in relationship to labor. So milk has been an extremely important topic in social zooarchaeology since it kind of took off, highlighting how the material substance of milk makes possible a particular set of embodied interactions between humans and herd animals. The consumption of non-human milks by humans is a complex set of practices that are grounded in the possibility of feeding humans, both infants and others, using the substance that's meant to feed young animals. Ethnographic and archaeological studies of milk production have highlighted herders' awareness of the balance between milk's use to grow herds and its possible diversion to human consumption. It is this underlying foundation, it underlies the discussion in the zooarchaeological literature of whether young animals in the past would have been required to stimulate milk letdown, as well as ethnographic studies that have shown that rich herders, particularly in African contexts, are able to use milk production to expand their wealth and cattle in ways that poorer herders who are more constrained both by the need to feed themselves, but also their young animals, cannot. So social zooarchaeologists have stressed the importance of physical intimacy and trust in the act of milking, identifying it as a crucial factor for shaping human-animal relations. And ethnographic and historical studies have highlighted how the cross-species consumption of animal milks can create forms of kinship or relatedness across species lines. For example, the classic ethnographic example of the Nuer. So Nuer clans had both human ancestors and ancestral herds. And these genealogical relations were explicitly grounded in the cross-species consumption of milk. And it's, the way it produces physical consubstantiality. So isotopic analysis intersects with this theoretical concern in really powerful ways. It offers us the ability to identify the timing of weaning, the seasonality of reproduction, and explore ways that practices of foddering can transform and alter it, and also potentially evidence, along with things like pottery residue analysis, of human dairy consumption. The other way to approach feeding and eating as a socially embedded is to consider the labor connected to feeding and eating animals. So for instance, the practice of providing fodder to animals rather than having them graze freely. So foddering, in a sense, represents a transfer of labor from herd animals themselves to human beings. This labor on behalf of non-human others may produce intimate forms of relating and forms of care, like the visceral connections between rural women and goats in contemporary Uttarakhand, vividly described by Radhika Govindarajan in her book Animal Intimacies. But feeding doesn't always create relations of intimacy or kinship between humans and herd animals. So feeding has also been a really crucial part of intensification and commoditized agricultural production. So Melanie Dupuy, describing the intensification of fluid milk production in the eastern United States in the early 20th century, describes this as a shift in the working relations between humans and cows. She writes, quote, "The increasing specialization of dairy was for farmers a taking on of the work previously done by the cow." In a rather different context, Marianne Lian places eating at the center of working relationships between humans and farm salmon. In industrialized agricultural production, providing specialized feed is meant to enhance efficiency and productivity, engineering herd animals into ideal forms. In these instances, labor shifts from animals to humans in forms of technology like fertilizers, tractors, and factories. And animals' quotidian agency in what they get to eat and when they eat it is constrained but never fully suppressed. So eating and drinking is, of course, as we've heard a lot about already, the nexus by which isotopes from the wider environment, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, are incorporated into the living tissues of animals and are eventually analyzed by archaeologists like us. So some isotopic methods examine eating and drinking directly as the process of interest, such as in studies of diet and weaning. For other isotopic methods, like those more interested in mobility, climate, birth seasonality, etc., diet is an intervening factor that shapes the use of this isotopic data as a proxy for the activity or process of interest. In addition, though we're not maybe supposed to talk about it at this conference, eating and feeding are foundational to the use of non-human animals as the source of baselines for the studies of human diet. So in my own work on herds and herders in the late Bronze Age Stakhovi Plain in Armenia, the data I collected led me to more directly consider the issue of feeding and eating. In some ways, I came to this focus as a fortuitous outcome of the specific data I collected. My initial research proposal stated that I would use radiogenic strontium and mass-dependent oxygen and carbon analysis to look at geographical and seasonal mobility and birth seasonality in cattle, sheep, and goats from sites in the Stakhovi Plain. At the time, I was very interested in mobility because I wanted to explore questions about the incorporation of pastoralists into social and political life in the Bronze Age, a time period where, for the region I'm working in, archaeologists have assumed that people and institutions became both more sedentary and more centralized. But, the somewhat unruly data I actually got led me down an unanticipated path. While the oxygen and carbon data, it's actually advanced, there we go. While the oxygen and carbon data did show some evidence for vertical mobility, what emerged more strongly was evidence for foddering and then some other weird trends in the data. So some of this evidence was tidy examples of foddering over the winter or foddering with C4 plants in an otherwise C3 dominant ecology. In addition to this more straightforward evidence, there's less clear stuff. So many of the sheep seem to have somewhat limited intra-tooth variation in carbon isotopes, suggesting some sort of homogeneity in their diet. Still yet less clear, but absolutely grounded in eating and drinking, is the data from some of the cattle that they're drinking water from an unknown, possibly isotopically stable source of water that I've been yet to be able to identify. So in the Sakhahovy Plain, it's all headwaters. There's no large lakes or rivers, so it's a little unclear what is happening there. So as I considered my data, and as I tried to incorporate some of the theoretical engagements from the social zooarchaeological literature, what I started to appreciate a little more fully was that foddering and pastoralist mobility can be thought about as two sets of practices by which humans and animals coordinate the labor of feeding, eating, and growing. And it emerges in response to the specific conditions of growth and reproduction for domesticated herd animals in these specific landscapes and ecologies. So herders in the late Bronze Age Sakhahovy Plain responded to these conditions in a variety of ways, responses that were in part shaped by the different needs and requirements of cattle and caprines, right? So we see that there's a little, what's going on with the cattle looks a little bit different than what's going on with the caprines. And the sense that foddering was a key practice for understanding human herd animal relations in the late Bronze Age was underscored by the results of the birth seasonality analysis I did. So the data showed that birth seasonality for sheep and goats was greatly expanded, whereas the birth seasonality of cattle was only marginally increased. Now, of course, the cattle sample is smaller than I would like, so there's always the possibility that we're missing a little bit of that variation. That's less of a problem for the sheep because we have a much nicer set of samples. So expanding the seasonality of reproduction would have required that herders be able to provide high quality food over the winter months. And this is at high altitude. It's covered in snow during the winter. So this is a serious problem that needs solving. And it doesn't appear that they were solving it by moving their herds to lower elevations. So expanding the birth seasonality of caprine shifted the relations between people and animals. It changed the distribution of labor and its seasonality. It likely also changed the rhythms and temporalities of the intimate relations produced by milk making and possibly also milk drinking. Obviously a little harder to track without, other kinds of data, but it's suggestive. Also suggestive in this regard is the incorporation of very young lambs and kids in the Kurgan burials in the Sakhahovy Plain, alongside large numbers of ceramic vessels and other grave goods. The embodied relations of milk making and caprine growing may have also transformed the relations between humans, caprine, cattle, and landscapes as members of a larger interrelated multi-species community. So the data from these analyses and the fact that the late Bronze Age is comparatively understudied means that my analyses tend to raise more questions than they provide answers. But it gives us a glimpse of the way that herds and herders worked and lived together, suggesting that there were meaningful differences in how humans lived with caprines and cattle. So to conclude, eating and feeding are complex processes chemically, biologically, but I would also add as well socially. And this complexity means that there are very real problems of equifinality involved in interpreting isotopic data. Centering eating and feeding helps to bring questions about human-animal relations into the same frame as our questions about the kind of variation we expect to see in isotopic signals or proxies. It becomes another factor to consider when we think about our data, and we can kind of add it to the list of things that we might expect to add noise or potentially, if we're unlucky, erase signals of interest. So in light of this complexity, and I think in light of many of the other papers given today, I think that exploratory approaches to data could be really productive. Homologous to the distinction between hypothesis testing and exploratory data analysis and statistics, this shift is about moving away from a paradigm of model matching, which tends to be quite common in archaeology, and towards one that is a little more open-ended and that follows the data to new questions and, ideally to new answers as well. So it retains a close attention to the specifics of how isotopes move through geologies, hydrologies, ecologies, and bodies, while encouraging more open-ended forms of interpretation. Okay, thank you so much.